If you've ever wondered if there was a trick to draw characters in perspective, there is. And I'll show you exactly how in this week's episode of YouTube Art School. There's nothing wrong with drawing characters from the front, without perspective most of the time. If anything, it's great to start with that. But being able to draw characters from any angle, from imagination, well, that gives you so much more options, so much more possibilities. So let me show you how. Quickly, let's get this class started. All right, class is in session. Pay attention. Here's the problem. You got good at drawing this. Characters facing the imaginary camera, facing us, the viewer. And I think most artists start this way. I sure did. Drawing characters from the front is easier. It allows you to more easily measure proportions, so it's great practice. But how about exploring different angles, different perspective for your characters? How do we go about doing that? Well, in today's class, I'll go over 3 different ways to approach drawing characters in perspective. First, how to rotate a character. Then, how to draw high and low angles, and then finally, how to place characters in an existing environment and match its perspective. Let's get right into it. The first thing we'll see is probably the easiest way to draw characters in perspective. It's how to rotate a character sideways, like how to draw a character in a 3/4 view like this maybe. I'm not going to get too technical here, don't you worry, but before we even try drawing a character in any perspective other than facing forward or backward, you'll want to first get familiar with your character mannequin. The one I'm using look like this, but yours could be completely different. It's basically the simplest form your characters will take, built out of simple geometric shapes like cylinders for the limbs, the neck, and abdomen of the character, and round sphere-like volumes for the ribcage, the head, and the shoulders. You don't want to start like this. Always start with a rough sketch of your mannequin as the starting point. I do that, most other pros do that, comic, manga artists do that, all pros do it for a reason. You always want to start rough, block things in, and then focus on the details after. So to rotate your characters, you should always start from a version in a neutral pose facing the camera to serve as reference. From here, I'll usually draw a symmetry line down the middle of the character, other lines for the legs and arms too as reference again for later, and then start with the simple volumes that make up my mannequin. The more overlapped they are, the more rotated your character will be, or seem to be. If we look at the 3 volumes that make up the torso and shoulders here, for example, the more I overlap these volumes, the more she seems to be facing sideways. It's important to maintain the same relationship between those volumes too. The shoulders should always be on the opposite side from the torso shape, and so if I move one of the shoulders forward this way, the other shoulder should move backwards by the same amount to make sure that they remain in a straight line. That's for a neutral pose, of course. As I draw each of those volumes, I just want to make sure that I follow the same guidelines for the rest of the character. Once all the basic volumes are done, I like to redraw my vertical lines to make sure that I understand where everything is facing. For a character in a neutral pose, which you should probably get comfortable doing first before doing anything else, well, that line should behave the same way on all of those volumes. If it's slightly off-center to the left on the head volume, for example, well, it'll be the same for all other volumes as well. It's not just the head that rotated, all the other body parts rotate as well by the same amount. So with this, it's a lot easier to place the smaller details of the anatomy, like the knees, the belly button, the line for the abs maybe, the sternum, and the point where the clavicles join at the base of the neck. If your guidelines are placed properly, it makes drawing those details a lot easier. One more thing that I think is worth mentioning for characters that have been rotated that way is that all overlapping surfaces will have a curve going in the same direction. This line, for example, overlaps the torso, pointing in the direction of the rotation. This one here too, overlapping the shoulder this time. From the back view, we can observe the same thing, all these curved lines pointing in the same direction. Often, artists will make the mistake of drawing those lines the same way they would for a character without perspective, and it's wrong. It's actually that overlap of volumes that really convey the perspective. Not doing that will make the character look flat. Now, if all of this is going a bit too fast, or if you're looking for a more beginner-friendly perspective class, well, I posted one just recently, so give that a watch first if needed. All of this will make a lot more sense. And then if you need more help than that, not only on perspective, but on anatomy, coloring, design, storytelling, shading, animal drawing, a complete art education basically, well, you should check out my art program with the link in the video description. It's a massive program meant to fully replace university or college, and I have a big back to school discount going all month for you if you're watching this now. Check that link down below and join our awesome community before the price goes up next month. I don't want you to miss out on this. Alright, so far we haven't even mentioned vanishing lines, and we'll save that for the last chapter when placing a character in an environment. Right now though, let's look at how to draw a character from above or from below. To make this easier this time, I'll draw a rectangle around my neutral character that once again will serve as reference. You can put lines wherever you prefer. I place some at the shoulder line, the crotch and the knees for now, and I'll use this as a guide for the blockout. Just gotta transform it in the perspective that I want using the transform tool, as if we're looking up to this character, like we're shorter. And then block in the mannequin using the same logic as for the first example, overlapping the volumes where the perspective is more pronounced, and just making sure that I keep the same sections of the body in the same squares. Here, the box looks like a rectangle, but it's actually a cylinder. Just one seen from the front without any kind of perspective, so it looks like a square. If I take another cylinder but add a perspective this time, well, it might look something like this. The horizon line is flat on the ground in this case, giving us the perspective of an ant maybe looking up at a human. The farther away the body part is from that horizon line, the more distorted it will seem, or in other words, the more overlap we'll get between those base volumes. We're always looking at the horizon at eye level, so anything above the horizon is as if we're looking upwards, and therefore we'll see everything from below, which obviously changes what we're able to see and what we can't see anymore. Here, the base of the neck is no longer visible for this one. It's hidden behind the torso shape. And you can see that this perspective, the distortion caused by the perspective, gradually gets less intense as we get closer to the horizon line. But back up here, the eyes seem closer to the top of the head than they were before. The ears, however, seem lower, and we see more of the jaw. Basically, we see more of the underside of a body part the higher we go, the farther away we get from the horizon line, like I said before. We could also have maybe a perspective like this, where the horizon is right in the middle, allowing us to see the character both from the top in its lower half and from below in its upper half. It's just double the work, so in this example, I'm not going to do that. Anyways, now this looks a lot more like a cylinder. It's not a flat surface, and that's a lot more appropriate for our overall body shape. We're not a flat cutout after all. From the top, we kind of look like this. Like we saw, the angle without perspective looks like straight lines. So I just have to make sure that the details I draw on this now maintain their relative locations. Everything in the front, like the chest, the eyes, nose, will seem like they're going up, while everything in the back of the character, like the ears, the back muscles, the back of the jaw, the shoulders too a little bit, will seem like they go down relative to the front of the body. Again, just because it's very important, that effect is more pronounced as we get further away from the horizon line. A trait I like to recommend to my students is to draw the character from the side view, roughly, and draw your gaze as a straight line. From down here, you can notice that we can't see the base of the neck. This part is blocking the view. Doing this exercise is kind of quick, and it can help you figure out much more easily just how much or how little to show a certain part depending on the angle. But back to those guidelines that I drew, you can see the chest, the waist, and all the details have to shift and curve to follow those guidelines. It doesn't have to be an exact science, but these guidelines really help place the details in the right-ish spot so that the effective perspective is more believable. And then we can notice again, in this case, all of those curves are pointing in the same direction. If they're above the horizon, they point up. If they're below, they tend to point down. If they're flush with the horizon, there's no curve. Now, the last method will use the vanishing points in the environment to help us create some guidelines. This will make it possible for you to place a character in an environment and make it feel like it belongs in there. Here's a random scene, and here's the horizon for this particular scene. I can find the vanishing point by extending those lines until they cross the horizon. Vanishing point 1 and vanishing point 2. Now with this, I have two options for drawing my character. Maybe I can use some extra vanishing lines to determine the height of my character, the middle of the body where the legs will begin, and use more lines to help me line up the shoulders, the hands, the knees, and the feet properly. Remember, we notice the distortion of the perspective more as we get away from the horizon, and that will be true here as well. With this drawn now, I can just position my mannequin, making sure that I line up everything based on those vanishing lines, keeping everything in mind from the previous two chapters. Here the feet are still lined up, the shoulders are angled differently but lined up with the scene. This character looks like it belongs, and I can now draw the rest of the details to complete my character. Another alternative method is to use those same vanishing lines but to construct a container box for the character. As long as the perspective of the box matches that of the environment, the idea is that the character built inside of it should too. Drawing characters or anything really, starting with a container box is a fantastic practice too, like I've mentioned in previous videos. One of the best drawing exercises out there. And with some practice, this should allow you to draw most figures in perspective, eventually fully from imagination. But don't hesitate to use references though, until you can clearly picture it in your head. And well, that's gonna be it for this week's class. I hope that was helpful. As usual, let me know in the comments. I read them all every week, even those on older videos. And if you haven't already, you can also grab my custom brush set that includes my favorite brushes, including the liner brush I used today, and you can get that for free with the link to my Cube Brush store in the video description. Now, make sure you pay the class fee of either one like or one sub if you found this helpful, and slap that bell icon to be on time for next week's class.